to the Concordia Strategic Dialogue on Equitable Economic Recovery. My name is Cordell Carter of the Aspen Institute, and I will be your guide today. We have an all-star cast, and I must apologize in advance. I've had to move to a location where there are lots of participants here taking part in Concordia, but the Wi-Fi is strongest here, so you had to move, right? Talk about equitable recovery. So today, we're going to be talking about we'll be convening these cross-sector leaders, a discussion how to achieve an equitable economic recovery. We all know what's been going on for the last 18 months. Moreover, we've known what's been going on for the last 2 generations of wealth inequality, of disparate opportunities for workers, the haves, the have not, you name it. But today we're going to get into it, and we have a great cast. I'm not going to take time to introduce them all. I want them, when we call on them, to just say a little bit about themselves before they start talking, and then get to the topic. So let's jump right in, shall we? So the very first question: what are the biggest challenges to advance a sustainable economic recovery? I'm going to ask 3 of our colleagues to weigh in here. We're going to start with Val Mohl. We're going to go with Mamadou Biteye and Mr. Richard Buery. Val, please take the floor.
Oh, thank you so much. And it's an absolute pleasure to be here. By way of a quick introduction, I am of Cherokee heritage. I am coming to you from the Muwekma lands in Northern California. And I spend my day focused on shifting capital so that we can see a real equitable distribution of capital. I'm the CFO of a large community foundation, the East Bay Community Foundation. I'm also the CEO of a Red Horse Financial Group focused on working with tribes, and I teach part-time entrepreneurialism with a racial equity lens at Stanford University, which is behind me in my screensaver. In answer to this question, which I think is a very important question, I would challenge us all in terms of how we even define the word equitable economic recovery. And the word recovery is what I want to focus on, because I've spent about 30 years of my life, even pre-COVID, pre-George Floyd, looking at the barriers for many of our communities in terms of access to capital and the inequitable distribution of wealth. And if we think recovery is simply going back to the way it was, and we repeat some of the same patterns, that's not a recovery. We need a complete reset in big ways. We need to shift capital. And I know everyone probably has this data, but I'm just going to say it one more time to drive it home. 70% of our global population identifies as people of color, 51% are women, and yet 97% of our assets are managed by white male-led entities. And that's just not equitable. And we need to look at it not about racism and not about sexism. We need to look at it logically about how we move and shift that capital. The barriers have generationally been land ownership and business ownership. And so I believe that we have to focus every day on our asset allocators in global markets. We have to focus on fund managers, and then of course businesses, and look at the entire pipeline. And it can't be small programs. It can't be one-offs done in an emergency state as a reactionary mode. It has to be huge amounts of capital shifting to really make equitable distribution actually happen.
Great, thank you. Mamadou.
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity. Very pleased to be here. I'm Mamadou Biteye, and I lead the global inclusive growth team at Visa and our social impact organization. Talking about recovery, I want to highlight that the pandemic has really accelerated 3 years of digitization into one. This means that the uptick of e-commerce meant that companies that were digitally enabled were able to be resilient, and in some cases even to thrive. This is why we believe here at Visa that digital equity and inclusion is a key factor in assuring that individuals and businesses are able to access opportunities. And this is why amidst the pandemic in June last year, we took a commitment to digitally enable 50 million micro and small businesses globally. And we did this by really leveraging our core infrastructure, our expertise and partnerships, actually to connect businesses and communities to those opportunities. To date, we are pleased to announce that we've reached 16 million of those small and micro businesses, which is 30% of our five-year commitment. So again, I think that digital equity and inclusion will be critical, because also research shows that actually during the pandemic, those businesses that were digitally connected, but also had the personnel that were digitally literate, were able to be resilient. In the contrary, those who were not digitally prepared actually had the biggest impact. So that's the first comment I want to make.
Great, thank you so much. Richard.
Thank you so much, Cordell. I'm so honored to have the opportunity to be here with you all. So Rich Buery, I am the CEO of Robinhood. Been here for 6 days. Robinhood is a philanthropy that supports poverty fighting organizations throughout New York City. I also teach at NYU and at Yale, and before joining Robinhood, I served for 4 years as a deputy mayor here in New York City. And so I really want to focus on our experience in New York City, which I do think reflects the challenges of other cities across the country and certainly across the world. New York City, as we know, has faced many crises in the past. Just in the past century, we can go from the Spanish flu to 9/11 to, of course, the current pandemic. And at each time, we followed different models of economic recovery and growth, from an austerity plan after the 70s financial crisis to a program of civic investment after 9/11. And I think the question for New York and for so many cities around the globe is going to be less about whether we quote unquote recover, because I have no doubt that at least for New York City, there are too many fundamentals that will mean that New York City will continue to be a place that attracts businesses and talent. I have no question that New York City will recover. The question is always, how will we recover? We recover in a way that allows all communities, including the poor, people of color, immigrants, and other vulnerable communities, to participate fully in that recovery and to benefit from economic growth and opportunity that come with recovery. Or will we recover in a way that perpetuates the inequalities that are a threat not only to our values as Americans, but truly a threat ultimately to the viability of American democracy itself? And it's important to remember, of course, as Val described, none of these disparities were caused by the pandemic, right? These disparities are central to the American economy, American way of life. And so the goal can never be to return to some status quo. We need to transform. We need a people-centric post-pandemic recovery designed to build a new future. For us at Robinhood, that is really anchored in 3 strategies. 1 is getting families back on their feet. 2, getting children back to school, not only physically, but actually getting them back to learning. And 3, getting New Yorkers back to work. So fundamentally, when we think about what are the challenges, I think fundamentally, the challenge to equitable recovery is our country's commitment to equity in the first place. Until we actually have a political transformation that prioritizes equality of opportunity, that makes the promise of America of equal opportunity for women, for people of color, for all people real, we have to break through those challenges if we're going to actually have recovery that looks the way we aspire it to look.
Great, thank you all so much. Let's move on to the next big guiding question. And that's, what role will big corporations and subject matter experts play in this recovery? Here we're going to hear from Rhett Buttle and Guy Ryder. Either of you can go first, whoever unmutes themselves first.
Guy, why don't you kick us off and I'll fill in after.
Okay, thanks very much. Just to introduce myself, my name's Guy Ryder. I'm the Director General of the International Labour Organization. That's part of the United Nations system, specialized agency that deals with social, economic, and labour policy. The first thing to say perhaps is, and I want to try to follow through on what the previous speakers have said, is We are now seeking to emerge, at least. I say seeking to emerge because I don't think it's quite as obvious that we are getting out of it, from the most severe economic and social crisis in living memory. In our estimation, the depths of the crisis in terms of labor market impacts was four times greater than the financial crisis that I guess New Yorkers and others will remember very, very well. This is a drama. And what we're seeing now with the economic recovery, we're seeing economic aggregates going in the right direction, is an extraordinarily uneven recovery track. That is to say, the richest countries, the most advanced countries, those with fiscal capacity and firepower, those with access to vaccines are bouncing back rather quickly, and the United States is one of those countries. The opposite is true for the developing and for the emerging economies. So, in a world that's promised through the UN 2030 agenda to leave nobody behind, we are in the process of leaving people already a long way behind, even further behind. So we're going in the wrong way, or we're going in different tracks, and it's not what it should be. So what do we do? What is the need to put this right? I think you've got a couple of parameters we need to act upon. Key is issues of finance and investment. The international community has done a very, very bad job of financing and distributing vaccines equitably. I think the United States is very pleased that it's got up to decent vaccination levels. I live in a country where it's about 50%. Continent of Africa is about 3%. Let's not forget that. And the other thing is, of course, fiscal firepower. $16 trillion thrown at recovery processes to date. Debt levels are higher than they've been in a long time. But the fact of the matter is that debt stress is now afflicting a very large number of developing countries. We have an incipient debt crisis. Now I have to try to answer the question, where does private enterprise and businesses fit into that? Well, I think the key, and the Secretary General of the UN has underlined this in the report he's just published, presenting to the General Assembly right now, I think the key is to align business objectives, business practices with the global policy goals that we are setting ourselves. And this has been said for many years by many different people. What we've been less good at is working out the mechanisms through which that alignment can be made effective. There are some who would insist that this is basically the job of government, and when government set the right policy parameters, then ipso facto, business will align because they will have no alternative but to align. At the other end of the spectrum is the notion that it will be through the voluntary action of companies, and we hear a great deal about responsible business practices, ESG, impact investment, and all the rest. If we get the financial market incentives right, it will happen through the market. And I think that's where the debate lies right now. The only thing I would say is whatever we've done so far has not been good enough because we're not getting there. It's simply not happening. So I would argue, particularly in the drama through which we have lived in recent months and years, and I have to say the existential threat of climate change, whatever else we are concerned with, climate change might make it all irrelevant. We've simply got to find new impetus to achieve this alignment of public and private objectives.
Thank you so much. Reed.
Well, hello, everyone. My name is Rhett Buttle. I'm the founder of Public-Private Strategies, and we're an organization that's focused on harnessing the private sector for good. We've been working both with a set of corporate actors across the world, as well as been very focused on US small and medium enterprise recovery. And so it's great to be here today. And I'll just pick up, I think, where Guy left off, which is, we're living in a moment in time where people don't trust our institutions. They don't trust our governments. They don't trust many of the ways in which we were able to communicate with them before. One of the interesting things that we're seeing, whether you look at the Edelman Barometer or you look at some of the research that Gallup has done, is that business is actually one of the few trusted institutions that's on the rise for the way that the public in general, and we see this globally as well as domestically here in the US, people look to for answers. And so I think this gets to the heart, Cordell, of the question, which is that, businesses, both large and small, have to be part of this solution. as we think about how we build back more equitably. And so I think in particular, the corporate community has a really important role to play with aligning some of these incentives that we were hearing Guy talk about. I wanted to spend a moment talking a little bit about the importance of small and medium enterprises. We've been doing a lot of work, as I mentioned at the top, primarily domestically, but small and medium enterprises play a crucial role in economies, not only here at the US, but also across the world, primarily as it relates to wealth building and wealth creation. Just here in the US, we know that just under half of all Americans work for a small and medium enterprise. But particularly when we look at communities of color, we see one of the fastest ways to build wealth for them is by owning or starting a small business. It's also really critically important to the fabric of communities and the way that people think about hiring. And so I was really struck by what I was hearing Val talk about when she was talking about sort of ways in which to move capital to build wealth. And I think one of the areas of sort of increasing alignment that we see not only here at home, but abroad is a focus on how do we help small and medium enterprises recover. Part of this gets to what we were hearing our colleague from Visa talk about. What are the things that these small and medium enterprises need? And I think the pandemic has showed us opportunities around digital tools and digitization to help small businesses grow and pivot. But I think it can't be underestimated what critical role they play in this recovery. With that, I'll pause there and turn to my other colleagues for the continued dialogue.
Great, thank you so much, Rhett. For our last question before we jump into a more general discourse, looking at Fatima, Michelle, and Ahmad in no particular order to answer the following. How can cross-sector partnerships help strengthen public policies? Who will go first? Let's start with the lawyer in the room, if you don't mind. Actually, I should identify you because there's probably a lot of lawyers here, myself included. I'm talking about Fatima.
Yes, I'm one of the lawyers and I lead a legal organization. So maybe that's what you meant. I'm Fatima Goss Graves. I'm president at the National Women's Law Center in Washington, D.C. And we work to fight for gender justice in the courts, in public policy, and in our society. And when I think about what it looks like to have the sorts of cross-sector partnerships and the way in which they can shape and influence public policy, I can't help but think about the sort of unusual or somewhat unusual suspects that have been coming together around the care crisis in this country. We are in a situation where for the first time, for some people for 18 months, they've had their children back in school. And for many, many more months before then, there was a lot of invisible or underpaid labor, largely borne by women, that was leading to a dramatic exit from the workforce, taking women back to levels that we haven't seen since the late 1980s. And this wasn't an issue that only women were concerned about. For the first time, I think, we had a clear understanding that the participation of women in the workforce and our ability to solve the care crisis in this country, it was a matter for families, it was a matter for women and communities, but businesses were deeply concerned. The Fed was deeply concerned. The Treasury Department was concerned. Every time we talked to chambers of Congress at the national level or at local levels, this was the top issue on their mind, solving the care crisis, because it was the top issue on the mind of their workforce and the thing that was getting in the way from any real and meaningful conversation around recovery. And coming together to shape policy solutions has led to the sort of investment that we had in the American Rescue Plan, where there was a $50 billion investment to stabilize the care sector, and a very serious line of work to position us seriously and deeply for a transformative investment going forward.
Great, thank you. Let's go with our government minister, Ahmad.
Yes, sorry. Good to be here. Can you hear me well? Yes.
Okay. So just following on the point that Fatima said, I think if anything, this is one of the biggest, global slowdowns that we have seen. It affected every single industry, public and private. So by virtue of the size and the scale of this recession, there's no way about just besides going with public and private partnerships. We have had to relook at all of our policies, including labor, financial services, you name it. We were forced to revisit our policies based on feedback from the private sector. The UAE has been blessed to be a hub for the region where global companies are based in the UAE, and I think MasterCard is one of them on this call with us, and they actually grow globally from here. So that was really an opportunity for us to really revisit during stressful times and really revisit all of our policies. We also went beyond that. So if you look at the healthcare side, we are building a facility in the UAE for vaccination, simply because even though the population is almost fully vaccinated, you're talking about 93% received one dose and 82% are fully inoculated. Yet the recovery is not as strong because we are an internationally exposed market, be it through tourism, exports and re-imports. So we really depend on neighboring markets like India, Saudi Arabia, and other regions as well. So with that in mind, the government negotiated the deal with China to offer the vaccines. The private sector took that upon themselves to provide production facility, and also Emirates Airlines have the biggest hub. They hold a facility that can take up to 10 million vials in store. And we're trying as well to send out these vaccines to the region, because we know even if we recover and we're able to not get the population, we can't do that in isolation, and we can't do that alone. So private sector really came a long way. If you look at education as well, 40% of our students are in private schools. We had to work really closely with private schools to ensure that we can switch on and off. We went multiple times from fully online to hybrid to offline. So I really think this helped, if anything, help governments look at private sector as a partner, whether it's in terms of shaping policies or also in terms of economic recovery, healthcare, and education. If I talk about my own turf, I'm the Minister of State for Entrepreneurship and SMEs. The VC funding in the UAE is about 59% of the whole Middle East North African region, and it has been stagnant for 4 years. It's about $500 million. So in the spirit of public-private partnership, we're launching an additional 50% through government funding, about $50 million, to look into startups that won't have necessarily an exponential growth, who are not necessarily on the radar of VCs, because they really are looking for exponential growth, tech startups and consumer facing. And we're going to fund those that are really critical to the country when it comes to food security, water security, and other aspects as well. So even on VC as well, which is typically private sector, you're seeing government actively playing a role without overstepping on what the private sector is.
Great, thank you. And now we turn to Michelle Nunn, who leads CARE International.
Great. Well, thank you. There's a lot to build upon here. I do lead CARE, which is a humanitarian and development organization. We are focused on both saving lives in emergencies, but also defeating poverty over the long term. And we center our work on women and girls because we know that we can't end poverty without gender equality. And so I would just start by saying that CARE has along with the entire world has been responding to, I think, these extraordinary forces: COVID, climate, and conflict. And until we have equitable vaccine, not only supply, but delivery and distribution, until we build a more sustainable economy that is truly tackling climate change, and until we also find ways of creating peace in areas of conflict where we've seen a doubling of conflict and 10 times the concentration of poverty in places of conflict, that we can't build a truly more equitable economic recovery. So we have to tackle these big challenges. It's why we're coming together as a global community in these coming days, and hopefully that we'll have concerted leadership from our governmental leaders and the global community that must come together truly in an unprecedented way. None of those challenges are going to be dealt with without multi-sector partnerships and cooperation. And so I think all of us recognize that. And, I'll just give you one example in terms of, you asked, what are we each doing from multi-sector perspective? CARE, for instance, is tackling the issue of gender equality and also financial inclusion, and specifically focusing on unbanked women. There are close to 1 billion women that are unbanked in the world that don't have access to finances. And so we have a program, we actually run the largest micro savings program in the world with over 10 million people. Our goal is to get to 60 million people in the next 8 years. And we can't do that unless we are partnered with governments who are incorporating this into their public policy. And we also can't do that without private sector partners. So we're working with Mars and PepsiCo and others who are incorporating the savings program into the supply chain so that they can support, for instance, women smallholder farmers in ways that enable them to have access to diversified income and higher productive yields and equitable capacity to have access to markets. So that's just one example, but I think that this idea that we have to get at the systemic enabling conditions for a global economic recovery, and we also have to engage multi-sectors around the big aspirations that we have. And we have a great distance to travel, and a recognition of that demands a kind of boldness and audacity that I hope that we'll see in the next few days from global leadership.
Great, thank you so much. And U.S. Representative French Hill just joined. And so, sir, please, we were just finishing the guiding questions about to lead into the general discussion. So we'll just let you take it from anywhere you want to start. But the question on the table is, how can cross-sector partnerships help strengthen public policies?
Good. Well, first, let me say how much I appreciate the chance to be with everybody today, and thank the leadership of Concordia for pulling together this global audience. And let me thank all of my colleagues on the call for their contributions and their leadership in their individual capacities. Greetings from the U.S. Capitol and Capitol Hill today in Washington. I'm glad to be with you. I'm in my 4th term in Congress. And before I was in Congress, I was in private business as a banker for almost 4 decades, and also worked in government twice before. Once 4 years for President Bush 41. I coordinated all economic policy at the White House staff for President Bush, and also led our financial assistance in Central Europe on behalf of the Treasury Department when the Berlin Wall fell. So it's great to be with this group. A couple of things I'd add to the discussion. I know you've talked about vaccine equity and vaccine distribution. And I think critical for both the private sector marshaling its resources and the NGO sector and the governmental sector is to try to get vaccine in those places that it's most essential to be distributed, where we have low vaccination rates in Africa, for example. The World Bank has done an excellent job in their vaccine fund. It's significant. It's targeted, I think, in the right way. But partnering with the NGO community, the health community is key. So much of the health distribution in Africa, for example, is through faith-based, the Catholic hospital system. They would be a critical partner there, in my view. And helping the poor recover from the pandemic also, I think, can be done in a better way, targeting in a macroeconomic way. I've been very opposed, for example, to the IMF doing a macro across the board special drawing rights issue, the SDR issue. In my view, that could have been much better targeted by the G7 and G30 countries, 2 of the poorest countries, and that way the targeted relief there would be combined with the World Bank's effort at vaccine, and I believe that would have been a much better way, both on vaccine recovery and economic foreign exchange recovery in these tough hit states. On the private sector, I think we should focus on getting people back to work safely, helping people recognize that the pandemic saw a lot of gaps in our economy and a lot of opportunity for entrepreneurship and filling those gaps, particularly in the telecommunications area, and providing a lot of services through telecommunications, which means in those countries where we don't have a robust telecommunications network. That's an opportunity for the private sector to invest along with the public sector. And my final comment on the private sector is the robustness of our supply chains. The pandemic uncovered unusual dependencies in supply chain, either geographically in countries that are not particularly good economic partners for other countries, or for gaps in the supply chain, even in a local geographic area, like supply chains in the United States or in the EU or in the Gulf states or in Africa. So the private sector can lead by a more robust and redundant and thoughtful approach to supply chains. For 40 years, we focused on just-in-time supply, and we were not focused on, but what happens if you have a major weather event or a telecommunications failure or a global health pandemic. But I'm glad to be with my friends, and thank you for letting me make some opening comments. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Representative. I appreciate that. Ladies and gentlemen, we're in the popcorn section, the general discussion. We've heard from an amazing array of people. And before the general audience joins with their questions, I just want to parrot back some themes that I have heard over the last half hour or so. COVID, conflict, climate, supply chains, equity, demographic shifts, poverty, the role of business, the role of government. How can, this is my question to you all, how can private NGOs, civil society organization, government leaders help shape an equitable economic recovery together? Anyone can start. You can just unmute yourself.
I'll jump in since I started. I'll repeat the pattern. I believe that we can all have a hand in shifting capital for an economic, equitable recovery. And if we look at part of the problem, I believe it's the lack of transparency and also the lack of education around assets and how assets are managed. Many individuals actually have the power to help with a recovery. Many individuals don't even know where their 401ks are invested. Many individuals don't understand and ask the questions about asset allocations. We have a broken system in our financial markets, not just Wall Street, but globally, that whether it's a software program or a network, country club type of network, that it defaults back to the same players. And if we're going to shift capital, we have to have transparency. We have to understand how to push and move that capital. And I do think that those of us in the business can create models that we share, that we don't keep to ourselves, so that we actually are creating roadmaps and best practices for others to shift capital. And it's going to take all of us working together, but we can't treat our finances as something that we're going to just hand over to someone and ignore it. It really is about transparency and education.
Can someone else speak to the capital shifts that Val just spoke of? Or another topic. I would love to talk about labor and some shifts we're seeing there, but I want to make sure we exhaust this lane on the necessity of capital shifts. Great.
Well,
Guy, could you talk about what, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, thanks, Cordell. I just thought it was not specifically on that topic, but an earlier part of the conversation that I wanted to reflect on, if that was okay. I was really struck, I think it was Rhett and Guy were talking about the importance of finding, and I think Ahmad was saying the same thing, about finding spaces where we can create alignment between different sectors, specifically the business sector and other sectors. And one of the places that I think about, just based on our experience in New York City, is childcare. Where there really is, there should be alignment between labor, the social sector, the public sector, business. We know in New York City, among families with working mothers, according to Robin Hood data, 87% use childcare But we also know that 70% of New York families with children between the ages of 0 and 4 live in communities where there is a profound lack of affordable quality childcare. And of course, quality childcare is one of the fundamental barriers that keeps people from returning to work. It's one of the fundamental barriers to gender equity. It's one of the fundamental barriers to businesses being able to find the labor and talent they need to be successful. So it's one of those places where there should be and can be deep alignment between a variety of sectors. And I think that to the extent that we can lean into those alliances, there are real powerful pathways forward together to achieve some of the challenges we face. And as Rhett mentioned, as a trust barometer, business remains in America one of the sectors where there really is a degree of trust among the public. In our experience in New York, about 8 years ago, we had a big fight to achieve a universal pre-kindergarten system. And one of the things that made that fight successful was the engagement of business leaders who came out and said that by investing in high quality pre-kindergarten, you're advancing education, you're advancing childcare in a way that makes sense for business and it's worth the investment. So as I was thinking about our experience in New York, I was reflecting on that and that being one of the ways that we can find pathways together.
Thank you so much, Rich. You brought up a topic that we've been covering at the Aspen Institute for over a year, and that is the impact of COVID on women in the workforce. Moreover, the entire labor force is shifting as a result of COVID. I wonder if Fatima and Guy could speak from their various perspectives on what I just stated, the she session, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, over 4 million women left the workforce during the pandemic. And that really did bring us back to 1980s levels in terms of workforce participation. And in a single month, what you saw last year, a year ago in September, when schools were supposed to, or people had hoped schools would come back a year ago and did not, you saw a dramatic loss of jobs, people leaving the workforce and not looking for new jobs in that period of time. And it was unquestionably tied to care. And so, one of the things that I think people need to think about in this period, many folks, including me, are thrilled to have children back in school, but it all is very fragile. It's fragile because of this pandemic, which is still ongoing, and the Delta variant means, especially for groups of children who are not vaccinated, that we might end up having school closures for longer periods of time. And we might end up having people needing access to paid leave and not having it. And so our care crisis, we're not yet through it. And I hope, and this is one of the areas where there's opportunity, that the pandemic has sort of awakened us to how fragile our care infrastructure was all along. It's not an accident that so many childcare workers left the workforce entirely, many of whom retrained and got different types of jobs, because we have relied on a system that underpays people to care for our most valuable folks. So I actually think the visibility that COVID brought us, the lessons, the very hard lessons that we have learned, and the unfortunate situation where the invisible and underpaid labor of women sort of kept us together this last 18 months will guide us as we're setting new policies at the national and local levels, will guide businesses as they're thinking about what are the types of things I need to have in place to support my workforce.
And Guy, what are you seeing from your perspective as labor is shifting, as what Fatima was saying, and also what Rich was saying? You lose childcare, you're going to lose women in the workforce, and some women are deciding not to come back. How is that impacting the hospitality industry, tourism industry, all of these different things where women are overrepresented in the workforce?
Yeah, well, I run the risk of just having a violent agreement with what Fatima just said, because everything she said in the US context resonates internationally as well. What have we seen? Last year, 2020, we saw the equivalent, because it's very difficult to measure these things in open unemployment terms, but we saw a reduction in hours actually worked in the world, meaning that the equivalent of 255 million full-time jobs were lost last calendar year. As I've said already, that's 4 times greater than what happened during the financial crisis. And as Fatima has emphasized, and it's a global trend, it was women who left the workforce in the very, very much greater numbers than men. The other group that suffered very, very badly, of course, was young people, was youth, for different reasons. And we could talk a little bit perhaps about the situation of young people in labor markets. Now, how do you explain this exodus of women? Firstly, where they were in the workforce in the first instance, they happened to be segregated, crowded into those sectors that were particularly hard hit by the fallout from the pandemic. So service, hospitality, all the things you've just mentioned, Cordell. So that was the first thing. Secondly, they're often in very insecure forms of employment. They were the easiest to move out when things got tough in enterprises. Thirdly, and I think this is a point Fatima was talking to, and I think it's where we need to focus our attention. You know, when schools closed, when care facilities were no longer available, as a sort of a societal norm, it was the women who had to give up the job and go home and take on the unpaid care duties. And the worrying thing is that seems to be a continuing phenomenon as people are coming back to work. Men are coming back more quickly than women. Men are coming back more quickly than women. And there are those who see this as a re-traditionalization of gender roles around the world. It does seem to be happening. And so we have to look, I think it's absolutely crucial, at the care economy. Fatima is absolutely right to say the care crisis is not over. I would say the care crisis was not specific to the pandemic. It pre-existed the pandemic. It will exist thereafter in 2 dimensions. One is the non-availability of affordable care, particularly for children, but not only for children, for people who need to work. The second element of the care crisis, logically speaking, is the pretty lousy working conditions that prevail in the care economy when it is professional, when it's not simply unpaid and done informally. We've underinvested in care and healthcare in many societies around the world. I make no specific reference to the United States. What are we seeing? What are we seeing today? At the same time as, you know, we are recognizing care and health staff as the heroes of the pandemic, they're leaving the industry. They're leaving the sector for better things because it's not a great place to work. It ain't a great place to work measured by any objective criteria of pay, of conditions, of career progression, and all the rest. So we've clearly got something wrong around the care economy. There are many other things perhaps one could add about vaccinations and other matters, but perhaps I should stop there and I can come back on other things later in the conversation. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much. And I want to hear from Mamadou and Michelle. Michelle referenced a micro banking program that is specifically targeting women as a means of uplift of those at the bottom of the economic ladder. I know Visas is heavily involved in very similar projects around the world. Mamadou, if you could speak to some action items that you all have undertaken to change the economics for folks on the bottom of the pyramid, if you will.
Yes, first of all, and I think that pertaining also to the issue that was being just discussed now, is actually the recognition that the very nature of business or small business is evolving. Today, what we are seeing is that it's no longer a local organization producing goods and distributing, but it is more a company or a small company that can act locally and thanks to digital actually distribute globally. So we've seen also the emergence of new types of businesses as well emerging. So it is really important to understand how this ecosystem of small business is evolving. and to the needs, also the evolving needs, and how we can support that. And this is why we created, for instance, the Visa Economic Empowerment Institute, which is really looking at that and also looking at equity to conduct research together with others and provide insights around this changing global dynamics for better policies, etc. But at the same time, we do also recognize two things. One, that financing and the infrastructure is important, but it is also critical to have access to skills. And skills are extremely important. And this is why we've been working to develop that. And we launched also last year our first practical business skills international, which actually is really focused on the key aspects that micro and small businesses can actually learn using digital, using mobile phones, etc., to be able to equip themselves with the type of skills that help them better manage, grow their businesses. But not only that, but also learning from what we've seen in the pandemic, being able also to build the resilience of these businesses. And lastly, I would say the other thing is also recognizing the importance of how digital is being leveraged by all the new fintechs, actually, which are able to reach out where actually traditional financial institutions cannot, and actually are much more nimble as well to support the business of those. So our work with BlackRock, with the international finance corporations and other partners actually have been really looking at how do we identify those, and also with Action Venture Lab to support them with capital investment, but also to see how do we crowd in more investors and different types of support to help them actually grow their impact. That's one aspect. It is also about how we partner with different governments and international institutions to actually also look at how policies can be made actually more enabling for those fintechs, because they are really critical in driving actually the financial inclusion, not just of individuals, but also businesses.
Great, Cordell, should I jump in and add to that? I'll go ahead and take.
Great. And Michelle, I have a scenario for you, since we have Representative Hill and Minister Belhoul on the phone. If you're game, are you game?
I'm game. I'm game.
Fantastic. Okay. So Michelle, you need to raise a lot of money to do this amazing thing that's going to lift the tide of many women across the world. What is your pitch to the U.S. House of Representatives, represented by Mr. French Hill? What's your pitch to the UAE and Minister Belhoul?
Yeah.
Is it different? Is it the same?
No, it's a good challenge. I think it is. I think it's the same, and I think it is the fundamental realization that we cannot have an equitable recovery, nor can we have a generative economy if we don't have equal access to resources and power. And right now we truly have a gender unequal global economy. And so my pitch would be simply that McKinsey study says that we can increase global GDP by 25% if women just had equal access to resources. We could feed 150 million more people in the world if women had more access to land, markets. And so it is both fundamental and foundational to an equitable society, and also, again, generative for communities and for nations. And so when we invest in that, so when the UAE or the US government invests in that, and when they do so coupled with private sector partnership, they have I would say an exponential impact. So we've partnered with organizations like Visa and MasterCard in the past, but imagine what it would mean if you could create, for instance, a model in which, for instance, 100 million women who were unbanked had access to banking and to savings and to commercial capital? And then what would it take to model that out so that you could include all of those women? So I guess that would be my pitch, and I would say that it is both a moral imperative and also it is an economic imperative, I think, from a growth and prosperity and equity perspective. So I don't know, how did I do?
Thank you so much.
Are y'all willing to step up and invest?
Well, this is my question to Representative Hill. I mean, the federal government has really changed the way it behaves in our markets over the last 18 months, something I've never seen in my 40 some odd years of living. And I just wonder, is this a trend that will continue, more investment from the federal government to the American public for great initiatives like Michelle just referenced, or do you see this as a temporary measure, and that's something we're going to revert back to business as usual once COVID is over?
Well, thanks. Again, good discussion. Let me say first, I'll talk domestically and then I'll shift maybe to an international point of view. Domestically in the pandemic, we put families first. That was actually the name of the first of 5 bipartisan bills, so that people had paid time off to cope with the virus, paid for vaccines, paid for testing. And we designed some of the initial emergency programs to keep people connected to work, keep people connected, continuity to their place of business through the Paycheck Protection Program and through the Federal Reserve and Treasury policies. It was all about keeping people off unemployment and actually be connected to their work. Why? Because they have access to healthcare. They have access to other benefits besides just the psychic benefit of being connected to a job. And it was, for the most part, very successful. Other people took different approaches. The UK took essentially a substitute of X amount of pay directly as an approach. But the whole idea there too was that continuity of work. Also, you were able to get some level of unemployment compensation if you were unemployment and maintain your health coverage, something America has never done before in the pandemic. So I think the pandemic programs were geared towards families, towards work, towards continuity of work. And finally, on the pandemic piece, in Arkansas, we tried to keep the economy open. So we did, in my home state of Arkansas, we didn't shut the economy down. So we didn't have the unemployment hit that a lot of states that completely shut down their economies did. And as a result, we have more people working. We had more people get back to work more quickly. We had the largest surplus in the state's history from tax revenues without the impact of the CARES Act and some of the other benefits. So that's my view on the pandemic. On the longer term issues domestically, look, I think the private sector and the public sector have a partnership on healthcare and welfare benefits for our families, but we need to reflect the gig economy and the self-employed economy. And we did that actually in our unemployment policies. For the first time in US history, if you were self-employed, you're a barber, you're a contract barber, you drove an Uber car, you worked in some aspect of the gig economy, you were covered by unemployment insurance. We've never done that before. And I think that kind of recognition of the self-employed economy will go forward as a policy element. I think there are a lot of ways to improve it. I don't think what we did in the pandemic is a good long-term approach, but I think it will be reflected, Cordell, to your point. And also looking internationally, America is one of the largest foreign aid contributors in the world. For the last 5 years, $283 billion. And a lot of that goes to women's empowerment and public health all around the world. And I would just remind everybody, before the pandemic, in America, we had the lowest unemployment rate for women in American history, the lowest unemployment rate for minorities in American history, and we had the fastest wage growth after inflation at the lowest end of the spectrum. But we have seen a slump in entrepreneurship before the pandemic. And this is concerning to me because I believe entrepreneurship and starting businesses is one of the great empowerment tools for women in society around the world and for minorities around the world. And so we have an entrepreneurship caucus now in the House and Senate that's seeking what are those barriers to company formation for all Americans, but particularly for those people of color or women. And so thanks, Cordell, for taking our discussion in that direction. And I'll again yield back to you.
Thank you. So I have a question for you, Rhett. As a person that sits in that intersection of public, private, NGO, collaborative space, and then reflecting upon the competencies from these different sectors. I mean, look at this phone. Is this the Zoom? You know, Val has invested billions of dollars all around the world. Richard has worked on anti-poverty measures from the city, state, local level. Guy has a view on labor all around the world. We can go on and on and on. There are tremendous amounts of competencies that are developed just in a normal way of business. Mamadou is in 190 markets. You think he knows something about policy? I suspect he does. What is your take on the best way that these various parties can partner for the greater good?
I think it's a few things. One, I think Guy turfed up some of this. One is it's really about alignment. And I think, we're starting to see more alignment, particularly between the government and the private sector. But I think that the second piece is that we should allow, as much as we all want to recover from COVID, we should definitely keep taking steps towards that. We shouldn't allow ourselves to stop thinking big. I think COVID allowed us to do some extraordinary things that we weren't able to do before. Think about capital transformation. There were, and we'll just take a program like the Paycheck Protection Program. You can say whatever you want about the PPP. There were a lot of things that were bad about it, but if you talk to most small business owners in the US, the Paycheck Protection Program really helped save their business, and it was something extraordinary that the US government had never done before, the way that it moved capital to businesses. And we've learned a lot from that program. And I think, taking innovations and learnings from COVID and allowing ourselves to continue to think big, to really work and align across sectors, but then to also make sure that we're taking the learnings from this experience and really that we're sort of applying it across sectors. I think those are some of the big things that we're seeing across all the different sectors of the economy, whether it be folks who are approaching this from a nonprofit angle, folks who are approaching this from a private sector angle, or quite frankly, the government. I do think what we hear a lot from the private sector and from the nonprofit community is we do need more from our governments. And it's some of that is investment. Obviously, we're having a robust conversation in America right now about what investment is going to look like. And, Fatima has been so eloquent about the need for investment in our care economy. And I just want to double down that that's not only important for working families, I would say to Representative French, that's also really important for entrepreneurs, for folks in communities of color and women. But I also think we need more certainty from our governments. And I think this gets back to some of the issues we were talking about before. Regardless of whatever system that you think is best, for me, I continue to truly believe that capitalism has created the best amount of wealth. I think it's the best way that we create small business and growth in the country. But we have descended, governments across the country have descended into sort of politics taking over certainty, and uncertainty is incredibly problematic for business. It's incredibly problematic for folks who are doing humanitarian work on the ground, trying to lift people out of color. And so I think one of the big issues we really need to focus on is how do we begin to sort of bring more certainty? And I think, part of that is just, leadership. And while we're seeing incredible leadership in lots of partners, I think we really need to press upon our sort of government leaders that this ability to sort of be clear around leadership is really important in this moment. I think many of us have been, this isn't a political comment, but I think many of us have been, re-inspired by the Biden administration's recommitment to things like NATO and the role that they're trying to play around vaccine coordination, and showing that sort of leadership has been a really important, I think, stalwart. So those are some of the things that I'm seeing sort of across sectors and some of the places where I'm seeing some of the gaps.
Thank you so much, Rhett. And I want to return to our other government official, Ahmad, and return back to that gender equality question that came up when Michelle and Fatima were talking about their work. And I just want a bird's eye view from you, Ahmad, with respect to gender equality. How are things in the UAE?
Yes, so if I take a step back and look at the region, we all know that within our region, gender equality is a big issue. When the UAE are trying to be a bit more progressive, and if anything, the government is far more progressive than the actual people. So if you notice, for example, in our parliament, 50% is elected and 50% is appointed. From the elected number, roughly 5% are women, but from the appointees by government, there's injection of a lot of females representation. So the government is trying to push forward to make gender equality at the forefront. There's a gender equality council. And funny enough, when you look at the higher education system, we have the diverse thing happening. We have 70% of all students in the higher education system are actually female. However, when you go into the workforce, it's not the same. So there's an issue of female participation in the workforce, and the government's trying to play an active role within prominent positions like the parliament. If you look at the ministers, for example, about 28% are female ministers by appointment. So the government's really trying to fix the policies. If we look at for example, the remote work policy, when the government shifted back to moving to the office, they gave an exception for female workers who have children that are grade 6 and lower. So again, we're trying to make it as much easy as it is for female members of the community to play an active role. However, we still believe that the culture is a bit lagging. When you look at the entrepreneurship, given the nature of entrepreneurs and given they come mostly from international institutions and mostly international markets, we've seen that the percentage of female founders in the UAE is about 20.8%, so almost 21. Compared to the US, from our partnership with LinkedIn, from what we've seen, the US is about 22%. So we're not far off when it comes to entrepreneurship. However, that is still not reflected into your legacy workforce. When it comes to civil services, women are far outweigh men because of the more relaxed, I think, requirements around maternity leave, around daycare. Every government institution is mandated to have daycare. So we seem to see female participation growing a little bit. Part of it is through government acceleration by appointment, part of it through government initiatives within the civil services, but I'm yet to see the level that I expect in private sector, with the exception of entrepreneurship. We're seeing a lot of pickup entrepreneurship. I know globally it's low, but compared to peers, we're there. So I think slowly and surely we'll get there. And I think the UAE is trying to promote that model for the region around us. I really think within the next 5 to 10 years, we'll reach the level that we actually aspire to. Thank you.
Thank you. And I just want to speak to one counter narrative. I suspect that Rich and Fatima saw this article in the cover of the Wall Street Journal last week. And it was a feature about young American men giving up on higher education. And the article went on to essentially state that this could be a real problem with respect to poverty and economic shifts a generation from now. And I wanted to open the floor in case there was a viewpoint on that narrative, that it's not just women that we should be concerned with. We should also be concerned with young men and their participation in post-secondary success, which eventually will lead to career opportunities. Any perspectives on that?
Yeah, Cordell, could I jump in on that?
Yes, please. Yes.
Yeah, I think this is an area that's really been of concern to people all across the country. I just was at a higher education meeting on Friday in the state of Tennessee, at a university meeting, and they have a 20% gap in graduation in 4 years between men and women. And this is at a very competitive private school in Tennessee. But when you talk to university presidents across the country, you see a decline in applications, as you point out, by males, and you see this performance gap in higher education, as illustrated by the example I just gave. So one thing I have focused on in these almost 7 years I've been in Congress is something I realized as an employer. back in Arkansas, and as a Chamber of Commerce chairman back in Little Rock years ago, which was how can we lower the dropout rate in high school? How can we increase attainment in high school? And how can we increase advancement in education for those, not someone, at mid-career, but someone at a young age. And so we have reformed our high school education system to have a college track, still have a Common Core college preparatory curricula, but we've added workforce as an integrated component in high school. Now, I will say I'm old enough to recall that middle school in America used to have that. And in the 1980s, we abandoned it with a college-only sort of focus for our young people. And we see tens of thousands of jobs available for people with only a modest amount of college, 1 or 2 years, or job skill training. So my point is that I think across the nation, we're seeing a workforce component in high school with the following goals: pursuit of happiness, to use an American point of view, immediate opportunity for earning advancement in education immediately after high school for someone not college bound. And so we're doing that through on-the-job training and apprenticeship type training at high school. It's a very German type approach that America had, but America abandoned sometime in the early 80s in our K through 12 system. I think it will help, Cordell, for the pursuit of happiness, earnings, educational attainment for those who don't go college bound, male and female. We're seeing as many, I go to these classes, there's as many girls in these classes as there are boys. So I'd say that's maybe modestly more men, but there are a lot of people in a lot of areas that just aren't college bound immediately at age 18. So I think that's a strategy that can really help. And I see it paying off in Michigan, Arkansas, North Carolina, and other states I've studied. Thanks.
If I could offer.
Guy, I wonder if you have a viewpoint on what Representative Hill just referenced, these multiple post-secondary success opportunities or pathways and its future impact on the labor force. I think you have a worldwide view of these things, so I'm very interested.
I think this is an extraordinarily important point. I think if you do look at the comparative data, those countries which are good at providing what we call the dual stream, that is to say, vocational on the one side, more academic options, combining the two and actually enabling people to move between one and the other over an early career path. And the representative has mentioned Germany. I'm sitting here in Switzerland. They also do it extremely well. Also to the advantage of, private employers love this stuff because they are able to develop and to retain the skills that they need. The calculation from the University of Zurich, for example, is that in Switzerland, the return on a 3-year apprenticeship for an employer is around 6%. It makes great economic sense, labor market sense. And at a time when we continually think about the mismatch between the skills which are demanded on modern labor markets and those that are produced by our educational system, what better way to eliminate that mismatch than actually to get employers and indeed labor involved in designing the educational system? So, this has got a proven track record. It truly has a proven track record. It's good for labor markets. It's good for the young people involved, particularly if they can move. I want to repeat that point. They don't have to make a definitive decision at the age of, in fact, 16. I know many families who think that, their child who doesn't make it to university has to take the second best option, which is a vocational apprenticeship course. I think we've got to get over that because, in fact, if you're making a logical, rational labor market choice, very often you go for that vocational outcome rather than the academic one. So tremendously important. And if I can just insert this thought in another thought, which is more and more present in our work, it's the notion that we have to get serious, if I can put it like that, about lifelong learning. I mean, labor market skill requirements are changing so very quickly because the world is changing so quickly that it is an illusion to think that we can spend our first 16, 17 years learning and the next 40, 50 years working. The two things are intertwined. They're not sequential, they're intertwined. Everybody recognizes this, but it's proving very difficult to work out the delivery systems that can actually make a reality of lifelong learning. Many countries are looking at this, individual learning accounts, all sorts of things. But I think this is one of the major agenda items for the future.
Thank you so much. And Fatima, I wonder if you have a perspective on the previous conversation, and if there are any leading policies, any states that you think are doing right by women with respect to these multiple pathways to career success as a means of economic recovery and progress.
No, I appreciate that, because if I could pick up where Guy left off, in fact, I actually think part of our challenge and really our opportunity as we think about a really significant infrastructure investment is to actually, at the front end of such a major investment, have an equity focus. Because the truth of the matter is, it's not a new idea that there is both job segregation in this country, and that looks like at career and technical education programs, learning segregation as well, and that a situation where you have some of the learning programs that lead to higher paid, higher skill jobs, that those are far more dominated by men, and learning programs that lead to lower paid jobs were far more dominated by women. And that is a thing that has remained true despite a lot of fits and starts at interventions. But the opportunity here with an infrastructure plan that has a lot of clean job opportunities, a lot of STEM, and a lot of opportunities to think differently around infrastructure is to begin with an equity focus to recruit more women and to recruit especially more women of color in these fields. Because the truth of the matter is, right now they make up a really, really tiny percentage in both the training programs and in the actual jobs. The other thing that I think is worth raising that I didn't hear come out around the decisions young people are making around four-year institution versus two-year institutions is the cost of these four-year institutions and the student debt that they are saddled with in this moment, where they're not actually able to get jobs that give them easy pathways to pay off that student debt. We have to tackle that crisis if we want more people, men or women, to see either four-year or two-year pathways as viable to them. There has to be a meaningful answer to the question around how they manage this debt and why we haven't come up with an option. If we're looking back many decades ago, it used to be that if you were a student from a low-income family, there were far more tools available so that you weren't saddled with the sort of debt that young people find themselves with today.
So can I?
Richard, so you go ahead.
Yeah, I want to follow up on this conversation and probably just in radical agreement to a couple of points. One, the guy said that it is not that there are only two pathways. It is that there are multiple and variable pathways, and that not every young person is going to, if you don't go immediately from high school to a four-year college degree, that does not mean that that pathway is unavailable to you. But different young people have different pathways to success, post-secondary or otherwise, and we need to make sure that we are creating space for those pathways. But also what Fatima said to me is so critical. All of these conversations you cannot have without having the layer of equity on top of it. And everything that I think you said, Fatima, about women could be said about Black people generally, Black men and women could be said about Latino men and women. One of the reasons why I think there is a reticence about recognizing the roles that multiple pathways can play is because we understand that there are too many pressures that track people of color, track women into certain pathways, not because of potential or preparation, but because of preconceptions about who is entitled to do certain kinds of work and get certain kinds of education. So we have to sort of place equity lenses on top of these policy choices. And we know that in American higher education, we talked about the enormous debt, just the American higher education is just so fundamentally broken in so many different ways. It's just not built to create true pathways for people. And there are enough schools and institutions in America that have shown a different way, everything from CUNY here in New York to famously Georgia State University. I think one of the things that we can think about on a federal level is how are universities succeeding in supporting multiple pathways? How are we succeeding in making sure that women, people of color, and others have affordable pathways to post-secondary training and higher education? We know a lot about what works, but right now they work in isolated pockets. Our image of what higher education in America is basically, it is something that is designed for elite folks who already generally have access to opportunity. It's not really designed broadly as a way to pull people from poverty and to give them pathways to social mobility. So just agree with what everyone said, especially this idea about it won't make sense unless you think about how equity plays into these challenges.
Thank you so much for that, Rich. We have two big questions from the audience, and I'm going to throw both of them out, and I will ask each of you in our last 13 minutes here to answer one or both, or maybe answer another question that you think is more relevant. But those two questions are, if all of you could do just one thing to achieve an equitable economic recovery with unlimited resources, what would that one thing be? That's question number one. Question number two. Let me navigate down here. What will best drive a country's immediate economic recovery? A more local approach, state level, if you will, or a global approach? So those are two questions. You had all the money in the world. One thing you could do, what would it be? And secondly, global or local? Who wants to start? I haven't heard from you in a while, Val. I would love for you to start us off again.
Well, I appreciate that. And I'm going to go with the second question because I do think there is extreme value in starting with infrastructure models at a smaller level. It could be local. Local we could define in many ways. As I mentioned, I work for the East Bay Community Foundation, which is located in Oakland, California, which is extremely diverse. And we are creating this model for shifting capital that I mentioned that I believe will then be able to be replicated globally. But I find that it's very hard to create a solution that is applicable globally without starting small first. And I want to kind of tie it together with everything we've been talking about. We've been talking about the care economy, we've been talking about education, and many of this evolves back to decision making. Who's at the top making decisions in our educational institutions? Who's at the top of our money institutions? And if it's not diverse, we're going to have these same problems over and over again. If we want to see change, we've got to change the decision making. And so by creating a model that shifts capital and then actually leads to a change in decision making. And just as one example, I've invested in a woman manager who is pushing her companies that she's invested in for better rights for their women employees, getting rid of the pay wage gap and getting more diversity, including the childcare issue. So it's all connected. But if I don't start, because we're philanthropic, and so we can take what's defined as a little more risk, if we don't start with that model of here's who we've invested in, here's the changes we see, now let's take it globally, I think it's too big to try to change everything at once. And so I love the model of local, city, state, creating models that then can be replicated.
Great. Who else has a response to either of the two questions? We have time for about 3 more.
Cordell, I'll jump in real quick and I'll be super brief.
Please.
I agree with Val that I think on the second question, I'm a big believer in the subsidiarity aspects of starting closest to the people. It's sort of an American tradition. If you're a Roman Catholic, it's a great aspect of the history of the church. So subsidiarity, I think we model things most successfully when we do it locally and build up. I think it gives you a stronger advocacy, and that gives you a chance to test different ideas all over under different economic, different education, different socioeconomic circumstances. On the first one, for me, honestly, unlimited funding, I would combine education is a gateway, and I would provide the right education to all people on an equitable basis. And as they age, meaning when they get into the equivalent of an American high school, that they'd have a mentor, not a guidance counselor, but a mentor. And if I had infinite money, our kids, whether they're college bound and headed to a professional world or a workforce bound, would have the education available to them and a mentor. I'll yield back.
I would like to comment on that and say that I would probably continue to do supporting really micro and small businesses because of what they mean. I believe that micro and small businesses are the backbone of the global economy, and the role they play in economic growth. We know their contribution to GDP, particularly in emerging markets. They constitute up to 80 and sometimes 90% of all businesses in emerging markets, and they are providing the majority of new jobs. So really, to promote economic growth and social inclusion, I think that they play an extremely important role. But also focusing on women-led and women-owned also micro businesses, facilitating their access to and control over capital would be also critical in doing that. I wouldn't do global versus local, because I think that having a global view, to be able also to mutualize good examples and best practices and bring them locally in the way and tropicalize them the way they are relevant are also very important. And support these micro and small businesses through digitization. We are in an increasingly digital world, and I think that it's important to look at both the enablement, which talks about education, skills, access, but it is also looking at the infrastructure, particularly in some countries where access to the digital world is and affordability is also key. So it's a lot, but still the basis is going to be really, to me, the backbone of the economy. Thank you.
Okay. Michelle, could you have the last word before I do the summation?
Yeah, I mean, I would say we have to address climate change because those people, that is an existential challenge, and those people who have contributed least to it are going to be disproportionately impacted and already are. So we are, 25 million plus people being displaced on an annual basis. We just simply cannot have an equitable world and a sustainable world without addressing climate change. So that's foundational. I will cheat a little bit and say I think gender equality is right up there, and I would make sure that we're looking at that lever. And I do think we have to both deal with issues at a local level and at a global level, because no matter what we're doing in terms of mangrove restoration in a local community, if the global community is not combating climate change or is not creating the ecosystems for equitable capital distribution or power equities within our capital systems, then we can't make the progress that we need. And last thing, I just want to throw in that the UN Food System Summit is happening on Thursday. Almost half of the world's population are dependent upon livelihoods that are made in the food systems, and we have to create a more sustainable, equitable food system, which is providing decent wages and livelihoods for those who are producing our food and who are too often going hungry themselves.
Great, thank you so much. Wow, this has been an action-packed 90 minutes, but I'll try my best to summarize what I've heard from these expert voices. Number one, there has to be a recognition that equality of opportunity is important. We say gender equality, there's a lot of terms we threw out today, but the fact of the matter, women make up 53% of the world population. So if you want any progress in any direction, up or down, you have to invest in women. It's a numbers issue, that's all, right? Take the morality out of it. So that's number one. Number two, embracing all forms of post-secondary success. As Representative Hill said, college isn't for everyone. I was part of that shift in the late 80s when shop classes left. I remember looking forward to it. I wanted to build some things like my older cousins had done, and that opportunity wasn't for us. Why? Standardized tests started coming in the early 90s, and we had to focus on other things. And so I missed the opportunity to have a career in technical education. But there's also a negative narrative about folks who do not go to college, at least in the United States of America. That is something that we have to rid ourselves of. We have to embrace all forms of work and embrace all forms of people pursuing their happiness. Interesting note, Representative, the very first word was not pursuit of happiness, it's pursuit of property. Benjamin Franklin prevailed upon Thomas Jefferson to change the word to happiness. Why? Because in his mind, property meant income. Income meant I can do things now. The same principle holds clear today. You can't be happy if you can't earn an income. So all work is important. But thank you for bringing that to my remembrance. Access to more financial products. Mamadou and Michelle are doing some incredible work with people at the bottom of the pyramid, doing amazing things, trying to get more women, more people that are outside of and unbanked opportunities to be banked and have access to products. And lastly, wow, I mean, there's 18 things more, but I'll say lastly, well, two more things. Lifelong learning, as Guy mentioned, like this notion that I'm done with my education at 22 and live another 70 years if you're lucky, that's ridiculous. You're gonna learn all the time. We're gonna adjust, we're gonna have 15 different careers if we're lucky in our lifetime. And the last thing I'll say is the major narrative that we have defeated in the last 18 months is that the United States Congress cannot do anything on a bipartisan basis. So I wanna personally commend Representative Hill, as being a part of a leadership group that actually changed that narrative last year. So I commend that, and I hope for more of that in the next coming years. I thank everyone that joined us today. This has been a really robust dialogue. I learned a lot from you all. Thank you, Concordia, for hosting us, and best to all of you and all of your many endeavors.